First off, the rules of engagement. What exactly is science fiction?
Science fiction is fiction in which scientific speculation plays an integral part, by which I mean you can't take it out without making the whole story collapse.
That science needs to be part of this sci-fi equation might seem painfully obvious, but it rules out all the gods and monsters of mythology and fantasy, two genres that don't pretend to be based on science. That being said, when did science fiction all start? Back in the age of exploration, there was a lot of fuel for the imagination. In 1543, Copernicus first speculated that Earth was just one of many planetary bodies circling the sun. In 1610, his radical idea was confirmed by Galileo looking through an early telescope. The discoveries led to an explosion of imaginative fiction. Some 200 stories about space travel appeared in the 17th century, including The Man in the Moon by Bishop Francis Godwin. It's the somewhat plausible dream of early flight in which the hero harnesses himself to a flock of birds, and the birds take him to their ancient migratory signpost, the moon. All these early tales were long on adventure, but short on anything like real science. It would take until 1818 and the publication of a nightmarish novel to give a real jolt to the genre. Everyone everywhere knows the story of Frankenstein. But did you know that a teenager wrote it as part of a friendly wager?
Mary Shelley, when she was a teenager, she and two or three other friends of hers in their chateau in Switzerland, one night they said, let's see who can outdo the other in a kind of a ghost story.
What Mary Shelley came up with was more than just another ghost story. Her Dr. Frankenstein reanimates a body stitched together from corpses with a shock of electricity. Shelley borrowed her electrifying idea from the research of Italian scientist Luigi Galvani. During the 1780s, Galvani developed the theory that the brain sent out electric signals to the body. To prove it, Galvani and other scientists ran current through animal corpses and observed the muscles twitch and move as if the mind was still working. Shelley's bolt of literary lightning not only speculated about a real scientific process, it created the first great archetype of science fiction, the mad scientist.
Prior to Frankenstein, there were no stories of a scientist working in a laboratory. That was created 100% by Mary Shelley. The fantastic things that happened in literature prior to Frankenstein were the result of magicians, religious people, people who were half gods, as in the ancient Greeks. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein got the ball rolling on that kind of approach.
She also got the ball rolling on one of the great themes of science fiction, the idea of man pushing too far into God's domain.
He takes it upon himself to do godlike things, and so the gods punish him. And the great ineffability of the cosmos always leaves open this possibility that somehow if we push too far, if we push the edge too strongly, if we're too arrogant about what we do, then the cosmos may come back and bite us or undo us.
I think the best science fiction warns us not about the technologies or the inventions, but about ourselves. The whole power of science fiction is we put characters in charge, we put people in charge of technologies and ideas, and we model their behaviors based upon past experience.
But while Shelley pioneered core elements of science fiction, the actual science in her story wasn't convincing. Even 19th century readers needed to put their common sense on hold to swallow the far-fetched scheme of reanimation.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
But Edgar Allan Poe, first published in 1827, would be different. He would be the first writer to truly fool readers into thinking his incredible plots were true.
Edgar Allan Poe wrote science fiction, and because Poe was so successful in developing the new idea of the detective story, the mystery story, Poe is identified with that. But Poe was an early science fiction writer. Some people in the field think Poe was really the one that invented science fiction.
What Poe invented was science fiction's core literary concept, verisimilitude. Using facts, either real ones or ones just invented by the author, to convince readers that the impossible was possible. And on April 13, 1844, Poe did just that, when he published an account of what seemed to be the first transatlantic balloon trip from New York to London. Ballooning was a new technology in Poe's day, less than 70 years old. In reality, an unpowered manned balloon wouldn't make it across the Atlantic until 1978. Poe soon admitted that he had made the whole story up. But the Great Balloon Hoax, as it came to be called, proved the power of Poe's inventive mix of real scientific research and contrived truths to make readers believe the impossible. It was a technique that a young Frenchman named Jules Verne would use to jumpstart his landmark science fiction career. Born in 1828, Verne had the inspiration of Edgar Allan Poe on the one hand, and the scientific glories of the Industrial Revolution on the other.
The 19th century was very different than the 20th century. There was almost an inherent belief in progress, that through application of human rationality, through inventions, through science, we, the human species, could really improve our lot, improve the lot of our planet, even improve, in some sense, the lot of the cosmos itself.
Blending science with fiction certainly improved Verne's lot. In 1863, he published his first novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, an imaginative tale of a trip over Africa. It was so successful that his publisher immediately signed him for 40 more novels.
I think his work was an expression of what was exciting about the age, about an age in which the world was changing very rapidly, a sense of anything's possible, a dominant feeling of progress. Things were getting better, better living through science and technology.
Verne insisted on using only real scientific details in his stories. In 1865, he published From the Earth to the Moon. Verne's moonshot was a projectile shot out of a gigantic cannon 900 feet long. Amazingly, Verne's moonshot takes place in Florida. Verne chose the spot because it was close to the equator, the spot where the distance between the Earth and the Moon is shortest. It's one of the reasons NASA established the Kennedy Space Center in the same spot nearly 100 years later. The accuracy of Verne's vision extended even further. The lunar capsule in his book was nearly the same weight, size, and material, aluminum, as NASA's Apollo capsule. 5 years later, in 1870, Verne finished 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a story inspired by early attempts at submersible boats. Verne wrote of a huge craft he dubbed the Nautilus that was powered by electric batteries, themselves a cutting-edge technology for the time. Piloted by the genius madman Captain Nemo and equipped with air tanks, sleeping quarters, and every modern luxury, it could sustain an entire crew for months under the sea. Verne's creation seemed to prefigure the first nuclear-powered submarine launched in 1954, which the U.S. Navy named the USS Nautilus. Jules Verne had invented a wildly popular style of fiction. Take some real science and imagine its possibilities, then build a rousing adventure yarn around it.
His science fiction is classic. isn't this an exciting new toy? And, what would happen if we use these toys? And, his stories are enjoyable enough, but there's very little connection to, well, how is this going to revolutionize society socially?
Whatever social commentary there was in Verne's novels was lost to English and American readers, thanks to oversimplified translations from the original French. The English-speaking world needed its own 19th century sci-fi champion, one that would take on social themes as well as technological ones, something that legendary author H.G. Wells was more than happy to do. Wells was born in 1866 in Kent, England, one generation removed from Jules Verne, when the Industrial Revolution was already showing its dark side. Clouds of soot hung over the factory town. Crime, prostitution, and poverty bred in the shadows of the smokestacks. By 1895, Herbert George Wells was a school teacher in poor health and with a failed marriage.
I'd be awfully tempted to go back to 1895 and find this science teacher working in London and tell him it's going to be okay, because at the time he was running out of money and he just left his wife and moved in with his girlfriend, and life wasn't looking all that good, and so let him know he's going to do great things.
Great things began to happen when he dusted off an old magazine article he had written called The Chronic Argonauts. Fleshed out to book length and given a new title, in 1895 it was published as The Time Machine. It tells the story of an inventor who travels to the year 802,701 and discovers that humanity has evolved into two races. The Eloi, beautiful, passive, who live above ground, and the Morlocks, beasts that live underground that use the Eloi as food.
The time travel story, The Time Machine, is really a social parable. The Morlocks underneath the earth, basically, are the workers who are so angry they have enslaved the former aristocracy, who now just almost become like beautiful grazing animals that the Morlocks eat.
And he started parodying the class structure, and suddenly the upper classes started getting very, very creeped out by this. For one thing, H.G. Wells was one of the best-selling authors of his day. He sold millions of copies. And this was not good. Science was suddenly being brought forward so that the tradespeople could read these books and enjoy them and understand them.
For the next 10 years, Wells turned out one chilling classic after another, like The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man. The War of the Worlds appeared in 1898, capitalizing on a popular fixation with life on Mars.
I think of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which he conceptualizes as a vision of imperialism. The British and French empires going around the world, destroying societies, sometimes exterminating whole peoples. And the only real claim to superiority is in technological superiority, specifically weapons superiority. So Wells sets up a formula in which the Martians are to Earthlings what the British and French imperialists are to peoples of color around the world.
The relationship of war and technology runs through much of Wells' work, sometimes to the point of prophecy. In The World Set Free, published in 1914, Wells predicts atomic power and the use of an atomic bomb in a future war with Germany. An uncanny prediction. Did Wells have some kind of crystal ball?
There were a lot of other things that he predicted as well that kind of didn't come true. In The Sleeper Awakes, man hasn't learned to fly heavier than aircraft until the late 60s or something like that. In the structure of a book of The Shape of Things to Come, there's a world government that takes over still in the 20th century, which clearly hasn't come to pass yet.
Nostradamus he wasn't, But it was probably enough for H.G. Wells to have brought high literary credibility to science fiction. For all the mind-bending tales of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells at the start of the 20th century, there was still no such thing as science fiction.
Oh, you must be kidding.
It was still more of a literary lark than a genre. For one thing, the term science fiction itself had yet to be coined.
In the 19th century, they were called scientific romances, which actually is not because there was much romance in them, but it was rather that the word romance in those days had an older meaning, which meant novel.
But science fiction was about to make the leap across the Atlantic to America, where a new breed of authors didn't give a damn what the intellectuals thought.
Over in America, where a class system is just impossible to figure out anyway, this other thing was starting up, this rough pulp-based action-adventure science fiction.
By the early 1900s, public education had made readers out of many poor working-class Americans. So evolved the pulps. The pulps were weekly serials printed on low-cost, pulpy paper. At anywhere from a nickel to 2 bits a pop, they were affordable to just about anyone.
Here in North America, and a little bit in England, you have the era of the pulp novel, or pulp stories, where as fast as the writers could churn stories out, there was a market for them.
Then, in 1912, the pulps would spawn science fiction's first great American author, Edgar Rice Burroughs. Burroughs was the black sheep of a prominent Chicago family. By 35, he had been everything from a rancher to a pencil sharpener wholesaler, but couldn't seem to find his niche. Until the day he picked up a pulp magazine and declared, "If people were paid for writing such rot as I read in some of those magazines, I could write stories just as rotten and entertaining." His first sci-fi adventure, Under the Moons of Mars, was serialized in 1911. It was a rip-roaring adventure featuring hero John Carter fighting Apache Indians on one page and carousing with the Princess of Mars on the next. By the 20s, thanks to Burroughs' breed of high-action story, the science fiction genre was gaining financial success and what looked to be a future, in spite of a literary elite's choice to ignore it. But it still didn't have a name, until Hugo Gernsback came into the picture.
Hugo Gernsback looked around him and, he saw electricity doing things that had never been done before, people riding trains across continents at very fast speeds, airplanes, and he instantly understood that there were stories involved in these things.
The immigrant from Luxembourg began his love affair with technology as a designer and salesman of the very first personal radio.
The Telemco Wireless, a radio transmitter and a receiver in one unit, because there were no radio stations you could pick up in 1905. So, I think it rang a bell.
To help sell his $7.50 Telemco kits, Gernsback started publishing Modern Electrics, a popular science magazine with plenty of self-placed ads. Then in 1911, Gernsback included a piece of futuristic fiction he had written himself, chock full of predictions.
He predicted aquacates, night baseball, artificial synthetic clothing, learning at night from tapes, vending machines dispensing hot and cold foods and liquids, fluorescent lighting, radio networks, television. He actually diagrammed radar.
Gernsback was a real gadgeteer. He was full of visions of the future, and he frankly saw science fiction as a vehicle for making people imagine these possibilities and think about it.
In 1926, inspired by the positive response to the stories in Modern Electrics, Gernsback brought out what he called an entirely new kind of magazine, Amazing Stories. Subtitled The Magazine of Scientific Fiction, the first issue reprinted stories from Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Subsequent issues would feature stories by a wealth of up-and-coming writers, including Edgar Rice Burroughs. In the late 20s, Amazing Stories was science fiction, giving readers glimpses of strange worlds and amazing futures, even introducing Sci-Fi's poster boy, Buck Rogers. But Hugo Gernsback was the victim of his own success. A hostile takeover of his magazine in 1929 forced him into bankruptcy. The hijacked Amazing Stories continued circulation, with Gernsback out of the picture. But within a year, the tenacious Gernsback was back on the newsstands with two new magazines, Science Wonder Stories and Air Wonder Stories, designed to go head-to-head with his former pulp. One hitch. Amazing Stories still held the copyright to Gernsback's pet word, scientific fiction.
And having lost control of Amazing, he couldn't use the term science fiction. So he had to think of another term. So he thought of the term science fiction. And that was the one that caught.
A dozen other titles followed Gernsback's lead. But the new popularity of the pulps helped to foster Sci-Fi's first American public relations problem, brought about by the mag's trend-setting but tantalizing cover illustrations.
Science fiction was a no-no. One of the reasons was that in the 30s, later 30s, when pulp magazines began to proliferate, you would find these garish covers on pulp magazines with the girl in the bikini in a cellophane spacesuit floating around in space. Nothing really to do with the stories inside, but I would have to read those magazines within the larger size Saturday Evening Post magazine, so somebody couldn't see what I was reading.
The strategy of the pulp publishers was obvious. They were marketing to teenage boys. Lights, camera, action, blast off. From the spectacular to the just plain silly, the marriage of science fiction and film has been a roller coaster ride of wonder, fear, and fun. A ride that started way back in 1895. Georges Méliès was a master magician of Paris when in the late 1890s he decided to start making short films. Legend has it that for help he turned to France's premier filmmaking duo, the Lumière brothers.
And he said, I'd like to rent one of your cameras. And they said no, because they didn't want the competition. So according to this story, Méliès bribed the night watchman at the Lumière Brothers Film Works factory and thereby procured a camera.
Méliès soon discovered that with the help of lighting and camera tricks, he could render illusions that surpassed those he could conjure for live audiences. From 1896 to 1912, he concocted over 25 short films. The most famous was his 1902 masterpiece, A Trip to the Moon. As in the Jules Verne tale that inspired the film, the moonship is shot out of a cannon, but the chorus girls manning the artillery is a most un-Vernesian touch. Likewise, the classical visual gag of the moon landing.
And you see the man in the moon's face, and the rocket hits him right in the eye, and the guy goes, ouch. That was typical of Méliès's sense of humor, and part of this was as a magician, his goal was always to amaze and entertain people and make them laugh and make them sigh. So for Georges Méliès, there really wasn't the distinction between comedies and serious movies that we have today.
The plot was pure farce, but the trick effects captivated audiences. Méliès had set the bar for movie makers trying to capture the fantastic worlds of science fiction. a bar that would keep rising as a new century dazzled moviegoers with everything from robots to Tyrannosaurus Rex. Then in 1926, a German director would take all the newly learned techniques of special effects and wrap them around a plot of biting social commentary, creating what many still consider to be the best science fiction film ever made.
And it seemed like if you stand by a pool and skip a stone across it, that there's these whirls that get larger and larger and come out, and it seemed like from downtown Los Angeles that you were hearing amazing stories of something called Metropolis, and it was reaching everywhere. Everybody was talking about it.
Metropolis is set in the year 2026, 100 years after the film was released. It shows a dazzling, dreamlike city with a grim social reality. Shambling hordes of workers live in virtual slavery, while the privileged class spends their time in decadent pleasure gardens. Fritz Lang's celebrated visions might have been inspired by American skyscrapers, but his social universe is pre-war Germany, reflecting the power struggle between communists, socialists, and the budding Nazi Party. While the social comment was lost on many American audiences, the sheer spectacle was not. Lang's masterpiece took almost 2 years to complete and required 37,000 extras. In one scene, Lang wanted 6,000 men to shave their heads. The effect, like many of the film's trademark scenes, was unforgettable. Soon after the release of Metropolis, hard times came to America. A double whammy hit the film industry. First, the Depression, then the expensive overhaul of theaters to accommodate the talkies. Even 1931 sci-fi hit Frankenstein, which probably saved Universal Studios from bankruptcy, failed to shock life back into Hollywood's economy. Studios realized they couldn't pay for Metropolis quality effects anymore. Instead, science fiction found a cinematic home in the slot before the big budget main attraction, in movie house serials.
They were always cliffhangers, you know. How is he going to get out of this? And then there's a lot of science fiction lent itself to the serials.
One of the first sci-fi serials, The Phantom Empire, came out in 1935. It starred Gene Autry as, what else, a singing cowboy. In the story, Gene has a ranch for orphans funded by a singing radio show he performs each week. What makes the plot sci-fi is that Gene's gang is in a war with the Muranians, a race of lost men who live in an underground city. The battles always end when the time comes for Gene to sing in his radio show. Without the show, you see, he'd lose the ranch and all those kiddies would go homeless.
This is the lead robot from the serial The Phantom Empire, 20,000 feet beneath the surface of the world. Seems to be made out of cardboard.
With the success of The Phantom Empire, the studios took a second look at serials. A year later, sci-fi's most recognizable hero was born.
Flash! Flash! Flash!
Flash!
Oh, Flash!
Flash Gordon got its start as a comic strip. In 1936, Flash was at the height of its popularity. Universal Studios spent $350,000 for 12 episodes, which was 2 to 3 times the budget for an average serial. Flash Gordon was vintage space opera, a term used to describe science fiction that doesn't care about the hows and whys of technology. Not that anyone was taking notes.
Flash Gordon has been destroyed, but Ming's orders were to take him alive.
Sheer escapism? Not completely. Even Flash wasn't totally insulated from current events. The arch-villain Ming the Merciless was based on the dictators that surfaced in the 1930s.
Kill them all!
Science fiction, it seemed, even at its silliest, couldn't escape the headlines, and soon sci-fi would become a headline in its own right, thanks to a single radio broadcast in 1938. Martians, monsters, mutations, dystopias, weapons of mass destruction. In the early days, all this heady stuff was for hardcore fans only. Most Americans just didn't bother with science fiction and its dire predictions. But in the late 1930s, science fiction started hitting the mainstream. On October 30th, 1938, came the first sign that change was in the air, or rather, on the air.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
The War of the Worlds. The old tale of Martian invasion, written in 1898, had ripened into something oddly suited to 1938.
1938 was this amazing year. I mean, it's the year Superman first debuted, but it was also the year the atom was first smashed. The first time, you know, it was the beginning of atomic energy.
It was also the beginning of German aggression. In March 1938, Hitler provoked the political crisis which gave Austria to Germany. In September, Nazis had occupied the Sudetenland. With all this ominous news coming out of their radios, people needed a break. And so they dialed up variety shows like the Chase and Sanborn Hour with Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, which commanded about 90% of the listening audience. Opposite the wisecracking dummy on CBS was the Mercury Theater on the Air and its 23-year-old director, Orson Welles. The drama series was well regarded but barely made a dent in the ratings, as was the case on October 30th, until listeners started tuning in midway through the broadcast.
What happened, by quite a funny accident, it was the first example of zapping, channel zapping. People listened to the first comedy sketch by Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, and then Nelson Eddy came on to sing. And if you wanted to hear comedy and not singing, people started shifting the dial to see what else was on the air. Tuned into CBS, right about the time they got to Grover's Mill.
Now, nearer home, comes a special bulletin from Trenton, New Jersey. It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
The mock news bulletins were not unlike the real thing coming out of Europe. They followed the travels of a strange cylindrical object from Mars coming to rest on a farm in New Jersey, where suddenly the drama escalated.
Nothing's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and this thing must be hollow.
The reporter was played by Frank Riddick. If his performance seemed realistic, it was for good reason.
Riddick had gone and listened to recordings of the Hindenburg disaster from the year before, and he listened as Herb Morrison broke down, threw up, was just taken away by the horror.
The wind is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. Oh, the humanity.
And then Frank Riddick recreated that horror for the scene in the War of the Worlds.
Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Radio Martians had taken over the planet, and listeners bought it. By one estimate, at least 1.2 million people believed that America was under attack. But was this all due to the crafty broadcasting tricks of Mr. Wells? Or was it a sign of a deeper paradigm shift?
I think one of the biggest lessons the War of the Worlds teaches about science fiction is that people in this century had come to accept change and miraculous scientific change as commonplace.
The notorious broadcast and its aftermath also seemed to say that science fiction had grabbed at least a toehold on the cultural mainstream. But while Wells and the company grabbed the headlines, a more profound and permanent change was afoot, over in the world of pulps. In 1938, Astounding Stories magazine changed its name to Astounding Science Fiction. But this was more than a window dressing on the masthead. It reflected the audacious mission of its new editor, John W. Campbell, Jr.
I think most people consider the major change in the nature of science fiction, that probably the most important single change in its history, to be when John W. Campbell, Jr. took over the editorship of Astounding in approximately 1938. And more than any editor before him, he was doing two things. He was demanding equal emphasis on the science and the fiction.
He moved science fiction in the direction of the more realistic story as opposed to the pulp adventure kind of story that was basically a pirate tale set, you know, on the moons of Saturn rather than anything that dealt with rigorous scientific extrapolation or the creation of realistic societies that might exist in the future. So that he sort of moved everything in that direction.
No more bug-eyed monsters or sloppy science. Not in Campbell's magazine. His insistence on scientific plausibility would elevate the genre. One of this new breed of writers was a young Russian-born chemistry student, Isaac Asimov. Asimov's first brush with the world of pulp science fiction had been at his family's candy store in Brooklyn.
The family had no money, and he really couldn't buy these magazines for himself, so he would take them out when they came, and he would read the issues very, very carefully, so they were still in perfect condition, and then he would put them back on the shelves.
The kid in the candy store was a true prodigy. At the age of 16, he attended Columbia University. By 21, he had written over 30 stories, of which 14 had been published. Still, writing remained a sideline for Asimov, until John Campbell dangled a story idea before him.
Campbell had a very unique editing style. He would indeed give people ideas, and he was known to say that if you gave the same idea to 8 different writers, that they would return 8 different stories, and that they would all, you know, if they were good, they would all be usable.
John Campbell had suggested to Isaac that he might want to consider a story about what would it be like if there was a planet where people never saw nighttime. It was where there were several suns in the sky, and they had no concept of the nighttime. And what would it be like if once every couple of thousand years they did see the night sky?
Campbell and Asimov imagined that the people would be dumbfounded and terrified at the first sight of stars, and go mad because of it. Nightfall was published in Astounding. Ever since, it's been widely acclaimed as the best of all science fiction short stories. Asimov was just one of a legendary group of authors to emerge from the sci-fi renaissance of the late 30s, along with masters like Arthur C. Clarke and another Campbell prodigy, Robert Heinlein. In October 1938, 32-year-old ex-Navy officer Robert A. Heinlein read that Thrilling Wonder Stories was seeking submissions from unpublished writers and figured he'd give it a shot. But after a few months of writing, he realized that he had written something that was too good for Thrilling. and submitted it instead to Astounding. Editor John W. Campbell paid Highline $70 for Lifeline to appear in the August 1939 issue. It was double what other pulps were paying. But you didn't need to read the pulps to know that science fiction had arrived, and that it was on a frightening collision course with the real science of the day. U-boats prowl the deep. Buzz bombs and V-2 rockets streak through the skies. There was even radar, an invention predicted back in 1912 by Hugo Gernsback.
And the man who invented radar at first denounced Gernsback's claims. And then when he saw the original book and saw the diagrams, he said, yes, Gernsback had everything in place.
And all the while, the race was on to build the ultimate superweapon. The Manhattan Project was underway in utmost secrecy, and yet Astounding Science Fiction was publishing stories that mentioned an atomic bomb. Were John Campbell and his writers spilling the beans?
And so FBI agents appeared in the office of John W. Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding at that time, and wanted to know where the leak was. And he had to convince them that there was no leak. This was simply an extrapolation of knowledge that was available to anybody who was paying attention to the scientific journals.
And for those who had been paying attention to science fiction, what happened next was no surprise.
On the one hand, the good guys won World War II, but the victory came at a pretty awful price, namely the atom bomb.
Like the War of the Worlds broadcast, the bomb was another alarm bell for cultural change. Sci-fi had emerged as a mainstream force, and science fiction and real science were now permanent dance partners. The bomb would become one of the most dominant themes of the next decade, providing some of the most profound and profoundly silly moments in the history of science fiction. By 1946, World War II was over, and the Cold War had begun. And both science fiction and the anxious eyes of America were focused on two subjects: the Red Menace and the bomb. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy began grandstanding on the subject of alleged communists in government and Hollywood. The American witch hunt was on. In the ring of public opinion, science fiction was fighting back against the growing war on so-called un-American ideas. In 1953, a 33-year-old writer named Ray Bradbury, who had been mentored by the writers of the late 30s, released Fahrenheit 451. It's a haunting novel about a society where firemen are responsible for enforcing a ban on books by burning them. But one fireman begins to see the error of his ways and commits books to memory before burning them, making himself into a human library.
The theme of Fahrenheit 451, that each person memorizes a book and becomes a sort of living book, is a wonderful, even a beautiful theme.
But sci-fi filmmakers ravaged by the blacklists weren't about to touch a hot potato like McCarthyism. Not yet. But it was turning out the first of a provocative new breed of science fiction film. Destination Moon, released in 1950, was a documentary-style look at a possible moon mission. There's a high degree of scientific accuracy thanks to Robert A. Heinlein, who co-scripted the film. Heinlein labored over every detail, such as the magnetic space shoes that clanked on the inside of the ship, but not on the outside in the vacuum of space.
Destination Moon was an attempt to give a realistic science fiction movie. It was, there were very few movies that were realistic. In Destination Moon, Heinlein helped, of course, tried to make it as realistic as possible.
It also got an Oscar for special effects and made the producer George Pal the new champion of sci-fi on the screen. Pal would go on to make a score of classics, including a blockbuster version of The War of the Worlds that set the mold for countless invasion movies to come. That the universe could contain some alien intelligence captured American imaginations in 1947. It was then that businessman Ken Arnold described 9 discs flying over Washington state. It was one of the first nationally reported UFO sightings, and Hollywood pounced, capitalizing on the event with an ingenious 1951 film by director Robert Wise.
So I went over to see George Boussing, the producer, and he gave me the script to The Day the Earth Stood Still. Said, see if you like this. And so I took it back to my office and sat down and read it, and I absolutely loved it. I was delighted with it. So I called Julian right away and said, yes, I very much would like to do this.
What makes the Earth stand still is a strange craft appearing in the skies above Washington, D.C. The alien inside the flying saucer, Klaatu, is not here to attack mankind, but to deliver a warning. Stop warring amongst yourselves, he said, or Earth will be reduced to a burnt-out cinder.
All the shooting we did here was earthbound. It was all shot around Washington, outside of Washington, and everything. So it seemed to me, the fact that we shot it there and all, and the realistic area of Washington and seeing it all, made it seem almost more real science fact than science fiction.
The Day the Earth Stood Still was also a rare bird in that it was one of the few A movies of the period. B movies were the rule.
For a long time, science fiction films meant low-budget films. The major studios were really working more of their star-driven pictures, and they weren't thinking so much about science fiction.
The B movie approach to the issue of atomic warfare would become famous in its own way. In 1953, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms hit theaters, loosely based on a Ray Bradbury story. An ancient monster called a Rhedosaurus is awakened by an atomic blast. It was made for just under $200,000, and it raked in $5 million. With those box office numbers, other atomic beasties were sure to follow. From the giant irradiated ants of Them, to tarantulas, mantises, and the Radiation King himself, who appeared in 1954 from Toho Studios in Japan. Godzilla was the monstrous result of a nuclear test gone wrong. It was a message of sorts from a nation who knew firsthand the horrors of nuclear warfare.
It was on everybody's mind. And of course, if you're making horror films, it was an easy transition. In a horror film, you're always looking for what causes the monster. We can take the same concept and use it for atomic radiation. It was a godsend to makers of horror films.
Roger Corman's own contribution to the genre was 1957's Attack of the Crab Monsters. But perhaps these movies were so successful because of where they were shown, the drive-in. In the post-war years, this was America's hot date. The number of drive-in theaters grew from less than 200 in 1946 to more than 5,000 in 1958. So what played so well on the big outdoor screen? Did it really matter?
The story is pretty simple. It's pretty obvious. You just sit back and you're frightened. And, you know, if you're a guy, it's fun to take a girl to one of those movies. Maybe she'll get really frightened and cuddle up to you. That's good.
So we would very often go into a drive-in that had 2 screens, and there'd be a major studio film on one screen and a low-budget science fiction film on the other screen, and we would outgross, at least for Friday and Saturday night, the major studio film.
Truth be told, most teenagers wouldn't have gone to see them either if it weren't for those Promise Anything movie trailers.
I'm William Castle, and I feel obligated to warn you about the next attraction you will see at this theater.
in the theater hold on firmly to his seat, please?
Amid all the schlock, there were a few classics. In 1956, Shakespeare met science fiction. Forbidden Planet is The Tempest set in outer space, with a robot named Robbie as one of the departures from the Bard's original. Also the same year, there was a film about mysterious pods.
They're here already!
While The Invasion of the Body Snatchers delivered a perfectly good scare, it's said to be a parable about the anti-communist hysteria of the early 50s. Maybe Hollywood finally got its say about the McCarthy era.
You fail to understand, and the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
But then, on October 4th, 1957, paranoia had a new name: Sputnik. America, it seemed, had some catching up to do with the Soviets. And science fiction had some catching up to do with science.
The day I heard the news, I met with Steve Broidy, who was the president of Allied Artists, and I said, Steve, I can have a picture about space travel in the theaters in 90 days. He said, do you have an idea? I said, I don't have an idea other than it'll be in the theaters in 90 days, but I have always delivered for you before. Will you back me? He said, okay. He knew what my films would cost. He said, roughly your films have cost $80,000. I will give you $90,000. You've got $10,000 extra for the spaceships.
War of the Satellites came out in 1958. Roger Corman had gotten $10,000 for his spaceship. John F. Kennedy would soon ask for billions.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The clock began ticking towards the supreme achievement of the decade. We'd watch the whole drama unfold on live television, a medium that was also doing some exploring of the final frontier on its own. Sci-fi on TV. The underground genre and the underdog medium. A marriage made in heaven. Well, not at first. It started out as a very cheap affair.
Flying saucers!
Science fiction, in its earliest days on television, was very cheap to produce. Some of the earliest shows were shot at very cramped studios here in New York, one at the Wanamaker Hotel. And because science fiction wasn't a Western, you didn't have to have horses. You didn't have to have a corral. You didn't have to have a saloon with a brothel upstairs. All you needed was a very small set with some dials and maybe a big rock. And you could go outside and get a big rock. It didn't cost very much.
Do you know anything about flying a spaceship? Oh, indeedy, indeedy.
The first science fiction series, Captain Video, debuted in 1949 with a prop budget of just $25 a week. With just a few bucks for props, the producers had to be creative. So they came up with devices like the remote carrier beam. It was really just a TV set in a cardboard cabinet that beamed in stock footage from old westerns that the producers had purchased at bulk rates. The heroes of the episodic westerns were said to be undercover video rangers, working on Earth. It was this futuristic way to show cheap westerns that inspired the series to begin with. But even this mercenary effort was a hit in the ratings. Pretty soon, everyone joined in. A number of knockoffs were on the air, including Space Patrol and Rocky Jones' Space Ranger. Tom Corbett's Space Cadet was based on stories by Robert A. Heinlein. But production values were so dismal that Heinlein disowned the series. Still, someone was eating it all up. And if you grew up in the 50s, that someone was probably you.
Television at that time really did not offer too terribly much for children. Most of the fare, especially in the evenings, had to do with adult interests. But with science fiction, shows were created expressly for kids. If you could get a company like Kellogg's, a manufacturer of breakfast cereals, to buy into a show and guarantee its financial backing, then you've got it made, pal.
All that cozying up to the sponsors meant the plot wasn't as important as the plug. Fitting a spaceophone or an atomic cannon that really works into the script.
The sponsors had premiums. All you had to do was send in a box top and a quarter, and they'd send you this premium. Most of them were, you know, made out of cardboard and stuff, but some of them were quite nice. I remember a periscope that really worked, had 2 mirrors and a column going up. We had to also use them in the show. That was a problem sometimes. Some were fine to use in the show, but I'm sure the writers were tearing their hair out to try to find a way to put some of those things in. I remember one with a little gun with a rubber ball on the end. They put a little powder in it, and you squeeze it, and puff of powder came out. Oh, you know, how do you use that in a show?
While kiddies got bargain basement sci-fi, their parents got nothing at all. 50s primetime TV was wall-to-wall westerns, sitcoms, and variety shows. But just when it seems most predictable, television can pull off a shocker, which is what happened on CBS in 1959.
Now you think about that now, because this is the Twilight Zone.
I remember my brother and I only turned the lights off during one program each week. It was the Twilight Zone. It was to be enjoyed with the lights off. The theme music was so powerful. Rod Serling's voice, his narration, so powerful. It was so well written. Of course, as kids, we didn't know that it was the writing that was so good. We just knew that the stories were so cool, and that most likely we were going to be surprised by the ending.
Rod Serling was a heavyweight in network broadcasting. By the time he began The Twilight Zone in 1959, Serling had won 3 Emmys and was the first writer to receive a Peabody for outstanding television writing.
I'm Rod Serling, and I've always been interested in man's mind, in the heights and horizons beyond which it can transport itself.
Twilight Zone would become his most memorable accomplishment. Serling wrote 92 of Twilight Zone's 156 episodes and opened up the program as a proving ground for a wealth of new screen talent, including a young Canadian named William Shatner.
So I did 2 Twilight Zones, and both of which seem to touch some core of humanity, because they remain popular, and popular in many places around the world.
The solid ratings garnered for CBS during Twilight Zone's 5-year run helped other networks realize that prime time was ready for sci-fi. In 1964, NBC was about to make its own science fiction foray and turned to Gene Roddenberry, the head writer of the popular TV Western Have Gun Will Travel.
In '64, they came to him and asked him if he would write a science fiction show, an hour-long science fiction show. And he says, I don't know anything about science or technology. What are they asking me for? But he did know about one thing. He knew about people.
Star Trek, at its best, is classic storytelling. There is a protagonist, an antagonist. There's a dilemma. There is all that brings tension and resolves itself, and something else comes about as a result of the story.
In those waning days of the TV Western, Roddenberry pitched his idea as a wagon train to the stars. By 1964, the pilot episode of Star Trek was ready, with Jeffrey Hunter as the starship commander, Leonard Nimoy as the science officer, and Roddenberry's future wife, Majel Barrett, as second in command.
when NBC saw it, they said no. So we like it, we think there's something there, we want you to make another one. But we want you to make some changes. Number one, you got to get rid of the broad, because no one will believe a woman is now second in charge of a starship. Now, they did that. It's just 30 years ago. And they said, number two, you've got to get rid of the guy with the ears, because he looks too satanic. Well, that was the purpose. But Gene was thinking, everything is, I've got to have the Spock character. I've got to have it. It's going to break Majel's heart, but said, I'll make it up somehow to her. So anyway, what he says to people, or had said in his interviews after that, was that I thought I'd keep the Spock character and marry the woman because I didn't think Leonard would have it the other way around.
He did keep Majel on as a minor character, Nurse Chapel. Roddenberry's other casting decisions were even riskier. Nichelle Nichols as Lieutenant Uhura was one of the first black actresses in a recurring primetime role. Walter Koenig as Chekhov, a Russian character at the height of the Cold War, rounded out the cast. Almost unnoticed, William Shatner slipped into the role of Captain Kirk, and the first episode aired on September 8, 1966 on a nervous network and a miserly budget.
$186,000 per segment. I happen to know that because I wrote something about it, but and that I think was the latter day. It started off less than that in the first year. Of course, the dollar was worth more then, but still, you can say it wasn't worth that much less.
What it lacked in special effects, it made up for with writing. And the stories were often artful parables of the tumultuous times of the 1960s.
When you figure the black-white problem, the war in Vietnam, no way could you talk to the public. But Gene found a way. He put people in funny-looking costumes, set them on starships, painted them funny colors, and got away with it because it got past the censors. The censors didn't know what to look for.
Our writers took not only what was happening between two human beings, but where it was happening. And if it was happening between two societies, one of which was technically superior, had more technology than the other, then, and it was written around the Vietnam War, then you began to see a parallel. And if it was about warfare and whether we should arm one tribe to keep a parallel with the other tribe, then you began to see other factors that related to the world around us.
While the censors didn't catch on to the timely plots, many Americans did, including Martin Luther King Jr., who personally dissuaded Nichelle Nichols from quitting the show because of a salary dispute, telling her that she was a role model for all black women. The show began to build a core fan base. And in 1968, Star Trek scored high ratings among viewers with color TVs. But there just weren't many color TV sets back in 1968. And the show never finished above 50th in overall ratings. So NBC sent word that the series would be canceled.
By the third year, with some good stories, I thought, wow, this is better than anything I've seen on television. Then we were canceled. So I thought, well, maybe it's not. And then it just died. Well, that sound felt good. Too bad it didn't go longer, but then 3 years is a pretty good run.
The third season ensured that Star Trek had enough episodes, 79, to make it into syndication. But even that was still years in the future. In 1969, the fans of the show who had taken to calling themselves Trekkies were devastated. What could possibly replace the weekly adventures of Captain Kirk and the crew? Well, how about the dramatic finish of the space race? Mankind's 2,000-year-old dream and the promise of a slain president was about to come true. April 1968. MGM Studios, Stanley Kubrick, and Arthur C. Clarke are holding their collective breath. A film they'd been laboring on for 4 years was about to go into theaters. It was either going to be a blockbuster or the stinker of the year. Was America ready for 2001: A Space Odyssey? The advance word was no. The movie was savaged by most critics, among them Pauline Kael, who called it the biggest amateur movie of them all. Rock Hudson walked out of a screening muttering, "Would someone please tell me what the hell this is about?" But on April 6th, the movie opened in New York, and miraculously, the seats filled.
2001 came out, and I think everyone at that point realized, wow, this is really something. This is serious stuff. A lot of conservative science fiction readers didn't really get 2001, but that was okay. I think most of us who really got it realized that this was a generation-changing movie. That this was a movie that would change the way motion pictures and television were made.
"2001 was based on an old short story by Clarke called The Sentinel. But famously, Clarke and Kubrick jettisoned anything in the way of narration, and much in the way of explanation. It begins with the dawn of man, then waltzes into the year 2001, when space travel has become routine. A mystery emerges about a strange monolith and a malfunctioning supercomputer named HAL. Then the movie concludes with a 23-minute light show from the far reaches of space and time. Teenagers surrendered as if to a psychedelic experience, which wasn't lost on MGM executives, who changed the advertising tagline from an epic drama of adventure and exploration to the ultimate trip.
2001, I think, is one of the best science fiction pictures ever made. On the technical level, the special effects for its day, the special effects were wonderful, and the speculation about the origins of mankind and the future of mankind told through science and through some mysticism connected with science.
Mystical or mystifying, 2001 provided a dazzling visual overture for a trip we're about to make for real.
I mean, what, fly to the moon, for goodness sakes? My mother thought she had raised some kind of imbecile son, because I would say, we're going to fly to the moon, you know.
I know I was the resident crazy at high school. Everybody ridiculed little Forey Ackman, why he thinks there's going to be atomic power and color television and men are going to them. It never happened, never happened.
In July of 1969, science fiction and history collided once again. From Cape Canaveral, Florida, a mere 7 miles from where Jules Verne's imaginary moonshot began, a rocket cleared the tower.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
And slingshotted a landing craft towards the old man in the sky.
When I was sitting in front of my TV and I saw that rocket getting closer and closer and closer to the moon, I had a piece of paper and a pencil, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I wanted to record that magic moment.
Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
So when I saw a footstep on the moon, I said, vindication.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
All of the nerds and geeks got together to do something that had not happened in 3 billion years of the history of life on the Earth. Never, never before in all that history had a living thing stepped off this planet and set foot on another world. And all the fashion-conscious people said, well, what does this mean? They just planted a flag up there. It's just imperialism. And in high school, I had to explain to people what this was, how important it was. And a lot of people didn't get it. And now we realize, of course, that it's a watershed moment in human history.
But was the moon a stepping stone or a graveyard for our dreams of space travel? 5 more moon landings would follow, but the euphoria quickly wore off. By the mid-70s, science fiction was in the deep doldrums, until a single movie came along that changed everything.
The change brought about by Star Wars was envisioned brilliantly by George Lucas. He had been part of the generation that had grown up with science fiction films.
Hard to imagine now, but there was so little studio interest in Star Wars that Lucas planned it as a television miniseries for children. The eventual film was put together with World War II dogfight footage in place of the elaborate space battles which weren't ready until the last minute. Among other problems, Lucas couldn't afford to pay Sir Alec Guinness his asking rate. So the actor who played Obi-Wan Kenobi had to settle for a share of merchandising tie-ins. Lucas himself waived a director's fee for a healthy cut of merchandising and the rights to any sequels. In May 1977, Star Wars opened in just 50 theaters. It's said that some of the lucky ones who saw it first got right back in line for a second showing. Pretty soon, everyone joined in.
I loved Star Wars. They were bigger-than-life characters, and they were not meant to be real. And I loved the imagination.
Many believed it was more than movie-making. It was myth-making. May the Force be with you became the most recognizable tagline of the decade. But the skeptics might ask, is it really science fiction?
Star Wars is not science fiction. Star Wars is essentially a Western with metal horses and laser six-shooters and that sort of thing.
Not that anybody really cared. They couldn't get enough of Star Wars or its sequels or of Star Wars paraphernalia. To date, more than $4.5 billion worth of Star Wars merchandise has been sold. Science fiction that couldn't buy itself a cup of coffee a year earlier now had a blank check in Hollywood. Close Encounters of the Third Kind also came out in 1977 with its transcendent version of the first contact with an alien race. Director Steven Spielberg returned to the theme of aliens in 1982 with E.T. the Extraterrestrial, another giant jolt to the box office.
What's happened to all the big movies is the ride. You go on a ride.
All the while, of course, there was a ready-made franchise waiting in the wings. Star Trek: The Motion Picture came out in 1979, way over budget and poorly reviewed. But the phenomenon was now unstoppable. 5 more Star Trek movies with the original cast members followed. Then in 1987, Star Trek: The Next Generation debuted and became the longest-running series in syndication history. But how comfortable was science fiction itself as a big-budget crowd-pleaser? Had sci-fi sold out? Had the old outlaw genre finally gone legit?
I remember somebody writing an editorial around that time where they were saying, let's get science fiction out of the classroom and back into the gutter where it belongs. So I think the perception there was that once it became respectable, people working in it might tend to try too hard to be respectable and become too inhibited in their thinking about the future.
By the 1980s, no child born would ever know a world without space travel, without television, lasers, or atomic power. What did the rebellious genre of sci-fi have left to imagine that hadn't already been designed and built in the real world?
Science fiction is the most subversive genre of literature. Science fiction is the one genre that teaches that change is the norm, that what is today is not what will be, and that what is today isn't even what should be.
In the mid-'80s, Sci-Fi set its phasers on stun and went after a part of modern technology that was becoming the norm around the world, the computer. By the mid-'80s, computers, which started out a half-century before as room-filling leviathans of wires and vacuum tubes, were now small enough and cheap enough for every office desk. In 1984, 36-year-old William Gibson took a long look at where this digital revolution was taking us and painted a frightening picture of his vision with the novel Neuromancer.
Well, Neuromancer is William Gibson's most important novel. It's his breakthrough novel. The first sentence of the book is about as good as a first sentence gets in a novel.
The sky above the port, Gibson wrote, was the color of television tuned to a dead channel.
This idea that, you look up at the sky and it looks like a flickering, sickly television screen, that captures it right there, that the whole world is a television screen or an informational medium.
Gibson coined the word cyberspace for Neuromancer. While some would tout cyberspace as an information wonderland, Gibson saw it as a wasteland. The novel created a hard-boiled, technophobic style called cyberpunk, which owed much of its rebel spirit to the political climate of the 80s as it did to technology.
The world controlled by super corporations and overwhelming data, the individual has no power whatsoever except as a kind of freelance or pirate working with the technology, sort of against it on the margins of society.
Capitalism and computers may have been the rage in the 80s, but in the fast-moving world of sci-fi, they were passé within a decade. By the 1990s, biotechnology was the new kid on the block, scientifically speaking. Cloning and stem cell research, bacteriology, the Human Genome Project all began pushing the envelope of humanity's self-knowledge.
What we're going to be doing in the next 10 or 20 years is understanding who and what we really are. And that's what biology is all about.
Soon, a new breed of bioscience novels were on the shelves, like Greg Bear's Darwin's Radio, about a virus released from an archaeological dig, and Paul Levenson's Silk Code, about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.
We're going to continue to see physics at the cutting edge, but I think the 21st century is going to be the century of biology, and I think that science fiction will shine its flashlights into that future, just as it has throughout the past 150 years.
What will those flashlights reveal? What dark reaches of inner and outer space will the authors and filmmakers of science fiction illuminate? Will they offer up predictions of utopian dreams or unforeseen disasters? Or just let us see, as if through a keyhole, into the future?
The old phrase from World War I is, the bullet you don't hear is the one that gets you. And I think that's true in science fiction and predicting the future. We don't do prediction. We write stories that prepare people or warn people.
Yet there is no way to hide the self-fulfilling prophecy that science fiction itself has created.
Well, in the 21st century, as I look at the news channel and hear about space stations and space shuttles and cloning controversy, and is the president going to allow human cloning, and stem cell research to allow us to repair basic diseases and so on, I'm taken back to the 1940s. This is a cover on Astounding magazine from the 1940s. Big wall screen television and HD TV detail. The president is about to announce his policy on human cloning. That's a Robert Heinlein story, for God's sake. I feel so familiar where I am now. I keep having to look back over my shoulder and wonder if, someone's writing me.
What science fiction describes best is not monsters or machines, but our own selves, telling us how or if humanity can coexist with technology.
Every story is about people and the human condition. And whether there's a gremlin on your shoulder or a madman or a lover, it is the core of what the story is that touches you, not the technology.
Finally, for all its Star Wars mega hits, science fiction remains a cultural outsider. It's still the dangerous genre. Or put another way, it's the culture of youth, no matter what your age.
Keeps me young. My mind is open to new things. And I feel as young now, inside, as I did when I was a teenager. It's due to this ability to keep and nourish my imagination. That's the secret of a happy life.